has evolved. Resident Evil 4 for Nintendo GameCube. Rated M for mature. Only from Capcom.
For nearly 2 decades, Capcom's Resident Evil 4 has been a groundbreaking source of inspiration for modern video game developers, with creators of acclaimed series such as Gears of War, Dead Space, and The Last of Us all acknowledging its influence on their games. Though Resident Evil 4 has inspired many imitators, what can be said of its follow-ups created by its original developers? Fans had long awaited a proper successor to RE4, and although Resident Evil 5 offered some fun, it was not quite what many hoped for, and it took years of anticipation, but Capcom finally delivered Resident Evil Village, a title that finally satisfied many of the fans of 4. But in this video, I'm going to showcase some games that, while hardly qualifying as hidden gems, are often overlooked or unfairly shit on successors to RE4 that were crafted by its original creators. Often neglected or dismissed games that use the RE4 blueprint that were made with the involvement of either Resident Evil's creator and 4's director Shinji Mikami or Capcom. But before I get into my real recommendations, I want to quickly address a few honorable mentions and oddities. Resident Evil Degeneration is the next installment in the timeline of Leon's story after Resident Evil 4, but it's a movie, so I won't be covering it here. But there is actually a game adaptation of it that was released for mobile devices and later delisted, making it pretty difficult to play. From what I've seen, I wouldn't recommend playing it as it doesn't seem worth the effort of trying to get it to run. However, I do recommend you watch the Stop Skeletons from Fighting video about it if you're interested. Dead Rising Chop Till You Drop is a Wii port of the original Dead Rising built on the Resident Evil 4 Wii Edition engine. It features the same arsenal of weapons as RE4 and has many of the same features. Although the game has me cautiously interested, I haven't played it though because I've heard nothing but negative things. Killer 7 is kind of a third-person shooter that was produced by Shinji Mikami and directed by Suda51, but it was created alongside RE4 and has its own unique style, so I wouldn't really say it was influenced by it. God Hand was directed by Mikami and developed by Clover Studio within Capcom. God Hand is a king among cult classics, and it has a unique melee combat system which is slightly reminiscent of Resident Evil 4. But I only played God Hand very briefly, like a decade ago, so I'm not really in a position to make any definitive comments about it. Maybe I'll actually get around to playing through it someday. After Capcom shut down Clover, the majority of its staff went on to form Platinum Games. Mikami's first directing job since leaving Capcom resulted in Vanquish, a third-person shooter that blended fast-paced action with cover-based mechanics, somewhat similar to Gears of War, which, as I said, itself was influenced by RE4. While Vanquish is a great game, it's not the kind of experience that I would equate to RE4 though. Alright, now that those are out of the way, let's get into my real recommendations in order of release. Shadows of the Damned was produced by Suda51's Grasshopper manufacturer and Shinji Mikami, and it was initially planned to be a psychological horror game, but publisher EA forced them to turn it into a comedic third-person shooter in the vein of RE4. The game follows Garcia Hotspur as he travels through the different levels of hell to save his kidnapped girlfriend Paula. The plot is pretty much just Dante's Inferno. While the creature design and art style are great, the horror elements are more aesthetic than actually scary here. The game also has a juvenile crassness, sluggish character movement, and a super linear stage-based structure. Despite this, I recommend Shadows of the Damned to those curious, even with the caveat that it's not even close to as polished as Resident Evil 4. Unfortunately, this game isn't available digitally anywhere. However, if you have the disc, it is compatible with both Xbox One and Series X. Alternatively, you can always play the game on original hardware, or if you're willing to emulate, that is always an option. When Resident Evil Revelations was initially released for the 3DS, it was a remarkable feat to bring a full-fledged third-person Resident Evil experience to a handheld console. It also brought a welcome return to horror for the franchise. However, after it was released on consoles and PC, I played it, and I found it to be a good enough experience, but not quite as deserving of its shining reputation. Set before Resident Evil 5, Chris and his new partner Jessica go missing while investigating a terrorist organization, and Jill and her new partner Parker are sent to their last known position on a ship called the Queen Zenobia. In a similar way to RE4, the story here felt Metal Gear inspired, but unfortunately, I didn't have the same connection with it as I did with 4's story. Although I usually enjoy espionage-tinged vibes and scenery-chewing villains, In this case, it was too much and it distracted me from the overall experience. The game is split into shorter chapters, meant to encourage on-the-go play, but it ended up resulting in an odd feeling when playing it at home. With unexpected plot twists and cliffhangers at the end of most of the chapters in the game, it seemed like the developers were trying to capture the feeling of watching a weekly TV show. Unfortunately, this had the unintended consequence of making me feel disconnected from the game, as if I was being forced to take a break. Since I had the entire game right there, I had no need to discuss around the water cooler what might happen in the next episode, as you might do with a television drama. Also, many of the new characters here are truly terrible. Keith and Quint are by far the worst. They ended up reminding me of Iggy and Spike from the 1993 Super Mario Bros. Movie, and that isn't exactly a positive. Likewise, Jessica's portrayal here is an eye-roll worthy inclusion, an overly sexualized and poorly written character all around. Also, just the cherry on top, I'm not a fan of scanning in games, and this game has a lot of scanning. Even after all that though, I still recommend Resident Evil Revelations. Just make sure you get it on sale or something. When Shinji Mikami's The Evil Within was released in 2014, it received a lot of shit, and it still does to this day. However, when I finally played it, I was pleasantly surprised. You play as Sebastian Castellanos, a police officer that is quickly thrown into a psychological horror plot that I won't spoil. The narrative may be dumb and melodramatic, yet I found myself drawn in thanks to its unapologetic earnestness. Imagine a tense adventure combining the mind-bending concepts of with the eerie atmosphere of Silent Hill, but with the intense action of Resident Evil 4. The resource management is an essential component to this game, as you have very limited health and ammo items, which also ends up making the stealth a very necessary tactic here. The environments are diverse and provide an immersive atmosphere. Enemies and bosses come with a great variety of forms, each with great unique designs. As for weapons in this game, the crossbow kicks ass. It has elemental bolts that can be used to set up traps for unsuspecting enemies, and I'm convinced that this is the source of inspiration for the crossbow that was added to the RE4 remake. When the game first came out, it featured unpopular forced letterboxing, which caused a lot of controversy, but they came back later with a patch that allowed players to play the game in full 16:9. Besides the game's lack of polish in some areas, the only thing really about The Evil Within that disappointed me personally was a lack of an inventory system. But ultimately, I highly recommend it, even if it puts me in the minority of opinions on this one. Resident Evil Revelations 2 fucking rules. After the events of Resident Evil 5, Claire Redfield and Moira Burton, the daughter of Barry Burton, are kidnapped by mercenaries and taken to a mysterious island. Desperate for help, Moira calls out to her estranged father Barry, who pursues their captors to the island. Determined to save Claire and Moira, Barry teams up with a mysterious girl named Natalia that he finds on the island. This game was released when episodic game releases were all the rage, itself being released as episodes over the course of 4 weeks. Unlike the first Revelations, the structure of this game was more justified due to its independent releases over time. Additionally, the chapters are more substantial, creating a more cohesive story than the patchwork mess of Revelations 1. In addition to the popularity of episodic releases that Capcom was mimicking here, the success of The Last of Us must have been a major factor for Capcom when developing Resident Evil Revelations 2. Each chapter allows you to play as the two pairs of characters, Claire and Moira, and Barry and Natalia, the latter being the pair that seems to be inspired by Joel and Ellie. Though the release structure may also point to the inspiration coming from the Telltale Walking Dead series with the relationship between Lee and Clementine. If it was inspired by The Last of Us though, that would seem to be a mini theme here in this video. A game that was inspired by RE4 initially, going on to in turn inspire the creators of RE4. At first I had a negative reaction to Moira's attitude and characterization here, but as I accepted that it was just a realistic portrayal of a jaded young adult, I began to appreciate her. She has lots of reasons to be frustrated, and her and Barry's relationship becomes a real highlight of the game. It's handled with respect and sincerity, which is pretty impressive for a Resident Evil title. That said though, Revelations 2 offers the same over-the-top, thrilling, super-villainous plotting that Resident Evil is known for, and it executes it here excellently. The game leaves plenty of loose plot threads left to explore, and I'm hoping that they're eventually addressed in a Revelations 3. I highly recommend you play this one, and just because it has a nice fat 2 slapped on it, don't think you need to play Revelations 1 to appreciate this game. The connections that it has are very loose, and you can absolutely just skip straight to this one. The Evil Within 2 did exactly what was necessary to improve upon the original game. All the great features from the first installment, such as thrilling bosses, an awesome crossbow, the intense atmosphere, the large variety of enemies, and fascinating environments, have all been given the polish that most people besides myself demanded out of the original. The major new element here is an open world for you to explore that acts as a hub to the major story beats. To really get into the story of The Evil Within 2 would spoil the first game. So I'll just say that Sebastian learns that his daughter, who he believed to be dead, is still alive, and that gets him to go back into a similar scenario as the first game. Sebastian, who was presented as a rather flat character in the first game, is now the center of attention, and his story is thoroughly developed. I highly recommend The Evil Within 2, even if you didn't enjoy the first game or didn't play it at all. Unfortunately, due to the lack of success of The Evil Within 2 though, it is unlikely that we're going to be getting a third installment, which I think is a shame. If you're a fan of Resident Evil 4 and looking for similar games, I hope these were some great recommendations for you. Let me know in the comments if any of these piqued your interest, and if you enjoyed this video, a like would go a long way in helping me grow my channel. And if you like discovering games that you might have otherwise missed, why not subscribe? Alright, and that was the video. Now who's ready for some bingo?